Welcome to the characteristics and working of stereotyping, and we're going to be concluding this in terms of stereotyping in this video clip. Stereotype is a prejudice in terms of which people interpret people and groups and form a particular conception about them. The characteristics of stereotyping are the following, and this is what you need to include in your task for work. The characteristics of stereotyping. Stereotypes depend on generalization and simplification, which is that it's going to deny individuality and group a whole people with that same characteristic, saying that all people are this way, all women are inferior to men, for example. Stereotypes can be negative and positive depending on the group and how the person is assessed. And up until now, we have concentrated on mostly negative stereotypes, but it's important to note that there can be positive stereotypes as well. In other words, refusing to acknowledge the negative aspects of that person or that group. And then as well that we have stereotypes have very real and mainly negative social consequences for the group and the individual as part of the stereotype group. For example, stereotypes in Western culture by women, Jews, gypsies, Turks, blacks, gays, lesbians, and so on can contribute to maneuvering these groups into particular roles in society, where they may feel the need to isolate themselves. The result is a social reality that creates the impression that stereotypes are accurate all along. And then we do have some examples on page 257. The last one is that those who employ them would consider them to be true, and that stereotypes are not experienced as stereotypes, but it has an actual primordial and archetypical truth. A stereotype is then not seen as a prejudiced idea, but a true reflection of the characteristic of that person or group on the basis of which the person or group should be typed or classified. The next part breaks down the terms of an archetype, which is that it's a distinction of primordial ideas, experiences which are inherited and may have genetic basis in the unconscious mind, and inborn orientation, which we bring into the world of what these things are. And Jung also describes it as well in his own sense here. So an archetype is a typical character and action situation that represent universal patterns of human nature, such as it would be the hero, and so on and so on. An archetype is also known as a universal symbol, a theme, or any sort of symbol or setting, such as the creator, the innocent, the victim, and so on. There will be archetypes of the witch and the villain, and the hero is the common ones. Jung also talks about the unconsciousness implied in the mind of a child and how children are a blank sheet of paper when they're born, and the child is predestined from birth to think and feel in the same way as his primordial ancestors did. Whereas the archetype is an ancient primordial image, the stereotype has a social and ideological connotation. And then we have some examples of this, of the stereotypes, and sort of a last remark regarding the truth of stereotype as well that you can read through on page 258. The next section is going to be looking at the origin of stereotypes. I know this is not explicitly said into your model outline, but I'm just going to provide a brief background into the origin of stereotypes. It might clarify where this maybe does come from. Where does stereotypes come from? And before we conclude to that section, this is just supposed to sum up exactly what is the difference between an archetype versus a stereotype. Archetype is a reoccurring symbol where a stereotype is characterizing a group of people and denying their individuality. Archetypes can be dynamic and static as well, but stereotypes are usually portraying characters and oversimplify the character, and they often are characters. Here we talk about the origin of stereotypes by Hobbes, and this is looking at that the reason it all came about is different theories are available here, and you can read through them on page 259. But Hobbes had described it that in South America, Indians were viewed as chaotic, aggressive species of Homo homininian lupus, which equates them to a werewolf, meaning other. Hobbes equates them to this sort of animal behavior and an animal, and the image was other than the European or British descent. Africans were described as wild and associated with animal and animal behavior to make them seem like an other sort of characteristic there. The views were then strengthened with visual images of naked black Africans without clothing, and that clothing symbolized Western sides. Anything else was barbaric. Hegel argued that African was a continent without history. Therefore, the civilized that were wearing clothing and had Western ideals felt that it was their responsibility to civilize the uncivilized. And this is sort of an introduction of where the origin could have began, and sort of puts into the records of how it all began that the civilized had approached the uncivilized and had tried to educate them and help them. There are many debates about how this came about, emphasizing the others being barbaric, wild, and savage, and based off the werewolf myth, arguably. And the origin of the concept is bon savage, which is the noble savage, give moral support to the political idea and the idea of colonialism to civilize the savage. The noble savage, the noblesse oblige, the privilege and obligation of the civilized, the uncivilized. Basically, this means is it is the role of the civilized person that's going to colonize to civilize who they consider to be the other, the uncivilized. Then we have a theological perspective of the origin, which is to say that Africans were stereotyped as the children of Ham, a character in the Old Testament in the Bible associated with evil, and this provided a justification for slavery. Although slavery at this stage was colorless, and we're talking about during 16th, 17th centuries, the associated with Ham, with slavery, and with the curse of, they say, Canaan, became a central theme with the church and the treatment of race. They used a theological justification for the use of Africans as slaves. Africa was viewed as a continent of servants and to serve others, and given the connotation that they are evil. Dutch theology saw that although all descendants of Adam and Eve, through their offspring, Noah and his wife, they had created these continents personified by Shem, Asia, Ham, Africa, and Japheth, Europe. And you can obviously research this a little bit more further, since the text provides a very sort of basic understanding of this. But in terms of this, they're just showing how stereotypes are deeply rooted in people's thinking at a specific point of time due to the social, political, and economic ideologies, and maybe perhaps the theological interpretations. The next section that we're just going to conclude with is how the need to contextualize media representations, the media's critics, to take care not to prejudge media representations being stereotyped, because sometimes the media, when they're portraying something, maybe there are things that are getting in the way that they can't help that's going to portray a stereotype, such as the nature of the medium, the genre of the text, the reality and representation, the motive of the communicator, and the nature of perception. In terms of the nature of the medium, we need to note that sometimes a medium can have its own shortcomings. Many critics seem to ignore this, such as if a journalist is showing a very sort of controversial article and only has the ability to publish 100 words, and then they get cut off, they're not able to maybe keep going into the next page, and then it shows a very biased article and looks very stereotyped. So we need to also take into account that maybe the medium has an effect on how people see things, and might think that that's very stereotypical. So therefore, the nature of media communication as symbolic forms of expression and as structured representation must be kept in mind, and that we should really, they are also incapable of providing the real thing. We shouldn't expect them to. Sometimes even me being onto this video clip, it has its own limitations, where if we were in a class environment, we could expand on this work a little bit more. And sometimes that just having a single story or program or article could portray stereotypes. The next thing is stereotypes can be depicted in mostly comedies, and sometimes the genre of the media text should be criticized, but also that it can contain stereotype images of people. We do have an example in our page 261, criticizing an editorial like Madam and Eve as being stereotyped or not representative of reality is to ignore the fact that the editorial is a genre in ideological nature. Adverts also can have an effect on, stereotypes. Adverts are an abstraction of reality and thus have unrealistic and idealized representations. For example, we have an ad here of Jennifer Aniston showing smart water, and it's oh so beautiful and everything like that. And if you have the water, you will also have bouncy hair, maybe. So therefore, ads also are intended to be unrealistic expectations. And they also say that it can create needs and desires to act as aspirational role models and also sustain capitalist ideology of consumption. They're going to be talking more about the complex relationship between the represented reality and how it is portrayed there. And you can read through all the examples on page 262. There's also the motive or intention of the communicator that can sometimes be beyond the media's control, which is how is the person who is going to construct the story going to maybe put their own bias in there. And if you read page 262, you'll see examples of that sort of hate speech there and how it's been stereotyped Afrikaners who attended the Klein Karoo Arts Festival in Oudtshoorn. And then lastly, we have perception. It can be the perception of a member of a cultural group that the article is derogative, whilst other people in this group may not agree with that article. So it can also have an effect on who perceives that message. Then we end off with changing stereotypes. Stereotypes are very complex, and when we encounter them, we need to be very critical of our own views, sensitive towards others' feelings, and aware of the possible harm of those perceptions and how it could cause others. What we can do to combat stereotypes in the media organizations to have an employment policy. We can also have different planned balanced representations out there, television program that can be inclusive of all people and characters. We can also have a public must have the right of apply as well, of reply, and codes of conduct. We have completed our media studies coursework, and we're ending off the coursework right now. So remember to write down notes on sections that you don't understand about this work, about the stereotypes, the origin of stereotypes, all of that stuff. And please see your lesson plan and complete the textbook and non-VC Learn activities.